When I was on the faculty at the University of California in medicine and medical information science, which is probably the most important part of this, is I specialized in the design and evaluation of scientific research. Basically, how you go about telling when a piece of science is worth paying attention to. So in a way, we were perhaps uniquely qualified to undertake this project. And we spent almost 6 months going through the scientific literature and writing a 100-page, fully referenced, highly detailed appraisal of what the scientists actually showed about the benefits and harm being done by this extraordinary practice.
The study that we did resulted in some results that were really hard for us to believe, and they were shocking and they were actually disturbing because the Department of Conservation is supposed to engender trust, and yet what we found was that they had badly violated the public's trust.
DoC's research states that most New Zealand forest-dwelling birds are vulnerable to 1080 poison, either by eating baits directly or through secondary poisoning.
The evidence is overwhelming that aerial 1080 is killing tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of birds. The species involved are extensive. They include the robins, the tomtits, the Weka, the Morepork, the kea, the list goes on and on. We compiled the numbers on this based on DoC's own evidence, the documented cases where they looked at populations after 1080 drops and either had well-documented counts or radio-tagged birds. This is a small percentage of the drops, but you can put these data together and come to some fairly firm conclusions. Those conclusions are devastating. They're profoundly disturbing. The numbers vary from 3% to 30% of populations, depending on species, per drop. And these drops are happening every 2 to 3 years. You'd call this decimation, except that the word decimation means killing only 1 in 10. 1 in 10 would be a good day for the tomtits, as they generally seem to hit about 30%. 1 in 10 would be a good day for keas, as the evidence indicates that they're killing almost 25% there. So decimation is not the appropriate word to describe what DoC is doing to these native species. The situation could be worse. If you look at the 95% confidence intervals, it could be as much as from 20 to 50% of the species we know about, and many species just haven't been studied at all. When pushed into a corner, they admit that birds do die, but they defend the practice by saying that the populations are made up because of decreased predation by feral mammals. Now, that would be good. If they had evidence that that were the case, then I would say what they're doing is, at least with regard to the birds, the particular species, is a perfectly rational thing to do. But they have no evidence that, that the birds make up their populations. They have no evidence of benefit to any native species. No competent scientific study shows a benefit to any species of native birds. So DoC's rationalization on this is propaganda. I'm glad I'm not the one that has to defend this carnage. In 2008, someone in the Department of Conservation leaked an internal report to the Dominion Post. This internal report acknowledged the death of 7 of 17 keas on the Fox Glacier due to aerial 1080 poisoning.
The feathered fools of New Zealand's forests and mountains are falling victim to the very poison that's supposed to protect them. 7 West Coast kea have died since May. 6 of them had ingested recently dropped 1080 poison.
We've combined that with the numbers from the other tagged kea and have calculated the estimated death rate per drop for kias. It's around 25%, with a confidence interval that goes from 13 or 14 up to about 40.
The Conservation Department admits it's done little direct research into the effect of 1080 on kia numbers, but some believe these alpine entertainers are being wiped out in the high country by the very department that's supposed to be protecting them.
One of the things that this suggests is the extent to which DoC is withholding this information. This report about the kias would never hit the light of day had there not been a whistleblower. How did DoC respond? They did not apologize for the deaths. What they did do is they claimed that 40% of fledgling kias are killed by possums. There is no evidence to that effect in the scientific literature. I'm highly skeptical that they have evidence that 40% of kia fledglings are killed by possums. Now, if they've got it, by all means, they should trot it out right away. The issue is that there is no evidence that the kia population is being benefited by this practice. You have to have bottom line evidence that the population is being benefited. Not that the fledglings are being benefited, or that they are being preyed on by possums or not being preyed on possums. The question is, what is Aerial 1080 doing to this population? Now, it's going to take some extraordinary breeding and some extraordinary possum results to make up for 25% loss every 3 years due to DoC drops.
Weka are endemic to New Zealand and are part of the rail family. Weka are opportunists and scavengers. They eat insects, bush fruit, rats and mice and carrion.
Everybody's been led to believe that 1080 doesn't kill Weka, but while I was tramping the Copeland Valley I picked up a Weka on the side of the track. So I carted it out, gave it to the Department of Conservation and Fox Classy to be autopsied. And the end result was that it was found to have been killed by 1080.
Bird species are actually quite susceptible to 1080, and in fact both wekas and ducks have been measured by seeing just how much 1080 actually kills them, and the amount of 1080 we put on a hectare would be more than enough to kill 500 wekas with the amount of 1080 cereal bait that you put on a hectare. So enormous killing power out there.
Okay, here's a great example of how our wild creatures and birds are being slaughtered by 1080. Here's a dead possum, possibly poisoned, that the wekas are coming along and devouring in great amounts. In the name of conservation, let's just dump it all over the forest. Weka, we can afford to lose them. What else can we afford to lose? You could wipe out Weka, for example, in just one drop perhaps, because they like to pick on bits and pieces like this.
In the paper, Secondary Risks from 1080 in Carcasses, the authors state, while talking about Brodifacoum poisoning, for example, the entire western Weka population of Tawhitinui Island was exterminated by eating baits or dead or dying rats.
It's not only the baits we have to be concerned about in the forest, but this particular drop took place 4 months ago. Now the cool-off period used to be 3 months. I think they've just increased it to 6 months in a lot of areas, but this particular carcass here is still fairly intact, and I dare say that in another couple of months there'll still be some of it left, and it's still toxic for that whole period. Now if a dog or any other creature, a bird starts pecking at it, anything like that, I dare say they're going to suffer the same fate.
Once the poison is ingested by an animal, it is then retained in the carcass of that animal and is then capable of poisoning the next feeder down the food chain, whether that feeder be an insect, bird, animal, or even a human.
In areas where there's been repeated aerial drops, we've noticed an obvious reduction in Morepork, our only native owl. So I've decided to go and visit one of New Zealand's leading experts on Morepork to see what he's got to say.
I've seen huge effects, and I don't mean small, but huge effects of 1080 upon the Morepork. They do take hold of anything. They're scavengers. Anything that's small. We feed the owls out in the bush on mice. In fact, I've found dead rats, and I've even found a dead small baby stoat in an owl hide. There's no 1080 drops, or before 1080 drops started, I might get 3 or 4 birds handed in a year. Once the 1080s drop started, can be 16 or 17 times. And so my concern is, because the owl takes so long to reproduce numbers, we could see the end of the species in certain areas of our country.
Another danger facing the bird life in New Zealand is that what they're feeding their young may be poisonous and even killing their offspring. Now, it doesn't just stop with the carrion. It could be insects or even the larger birds taking whole baits back to the nest.
The effects of poisoning are very similar in birds to other animals as well. When birds are poisoned, they become quiet, they ruffle up their feathers, they drool and have difficulty breathing, they become clumsy and uncoordinated, they start to have twitching of their muscles and convulsions where their limbs become very stiff and their backs curve back, and then they have fits and they die. How long it takes a bird to die from 1080 is going to depend on the individual bird. One bird will differ from another. It's going to depend on how much poison they ate as well. So it's very hard to predict exactly how long a bird would have symptoms for. But in general, it's fair to say that a poisoned bird will have symptoms of 1080 poisoning for somewhere between hours and days.
Many New Zealand birds are vulnerable to secondary poisoning. This occurs when the bird consumes insects or the carrion of an animal that was poisoned or killed by 1080. Because there is no control over how much poison an animal ingests, animals that die contain varying amounts of poison in their carcass. The next feeder down the food chain then may receive either a sublethal or lethal dose of poison. Birds and animals that do recover from sublethal poisoning may be left with long-term disability or diminished breeding capability.
You take the robin study. It went on for 3 years, and what they showed was that a substantial portion of the robins died as a consequence of this. However, this being one of the few studies that looked at all 3 variables, death, fledgling success, and population success, no change in the population. So robins were killed. There was a slight increase in fledgling success, but it did not translate into population success. And yet DoC habitually cites this as proof that 1080 benefits robins, when we know, in fact, what it does is kill robins.
Looks like a tomtit. Pretty little guy, isn't he?
The specific issue of tomtit deaths and low dosage baits was addressed in by Westerbrook in 2005. What they found was that if they reduced the dose of cereal bellies low enough, they did dramatically reduce the death of tomtits. However, when they reduced the amount of 1080 in carrot baits to even very low levels, they still killed up to 50% of tomtits.
As we found out through an OIA, DoC is still using large quantities of carrot baits, both medium and low dose carrot baits in their drops.
Yeah, they don't deny it. And in fact, Irma authorized a dosage almost 10 times higher than the one that still killed 50% of tomtits. In addition to all that, we have a report from a DoC scientist, Claire Veltman, in which she concluded that the low bait strategy was not working. She did comment, however, that they presume that the deaths were compensated by increased breeding success, and that eventually the tomtits made it up. There's no proof of that.
And they referred to the robin study. Right. But the robin study didn't benefit the population. So it's sort of a circular reference situation where one references the other, bad study or non-consequential study, and it's a self-reinforcing rumor, effectively.
Right, that's what happens. And then Forest and Birds gets involved, and they pick up what DoC says the study shows and don't actually go and look at the study and amplify the whole process either. Pretty soon, you've got the whole population of New Zealand believing what is an absolute falsehood. Consider, for example, the 2003 Whirinaki Forest study in which they looked at caribou, the wood pigeon, and kaka. As usual, the elements of good scientific research design were missing. They studied fledgling success, but even then, they actually combined the results from the control and the study group, and that was the only thing they reported. They went on in the abstract section to claim that the study had worked. Not because they had shown that it worked, but because it had been shown to work at Motato in 2004. In that study, they looked at a total of 12 species of both native and feral birds. But there was only one randomized control area, which was demonstrably completely different from the treated area. So right from the start, the results were invalidated. The authors reported in the abstract section a statistically increased number of wood pigeons, caribou, which seems to have been the primary target of the research. However, in their analysis, they used an incorrect statistical, it's a linear statistical model, and so the study was doubly invalidated. Not only did they have a completely incomparable control group, which you could see from their own data, but the study was invalidated by they analyzed the data incorrectly. I mean, it's just a gross statistical error. But even so, it's instructive to look at how they reported what have to be called spurious results. What they reported in the abstract section of that paper was that the caribou population benefited from the use of aerial 1080. They failed to even mention in the abstract section that that same erroneous, fallacious analysis that they believed, you understand, they believed this analysis, also showed that there were decreased numbers of silver eyes and gray warblers. Now, it's hard to imagine how you can choose one native species and say that was an important find that aerial 1080 increased that, but it decreased the others. Well, of course, none of this is very meaningful because there's so many flaws in the study. We reanalyzed their data and were unable to show much value in it at all. But the one thing that absolutely did stand out was that minor birds population had increased relative pre and post and study to control areas by 400%. In other words, the big benefiter in that study was minor birds. This is consistent with the observation that feral species of birds may be doing at least as much harm to native species by displacing them from their ecological niches. DoC is doing absolutely nothing about the feral birds. The Morepork study is DoC's flagship study of benefit to native species. In fact, the Morepork study illustrates most of DoC's bad research and design habits. Historical controls, no randomization, no replication, and several statistical errors. Thus, even from the start, it does not meet the minimal criteria for scientific validity. In one promotional brochure, DOC claims that there was a 10-fold increase in kokako population. There is no indication of that in the scientific literature. The scientific report shows that the population may have gone from 55 to 85, but it was not as a consequence of Aerial 1080. The increase in population occurred 3 years after Aerial 1080 had been discontinued and was replaced by ground-based control methods. Nonetheless, DOC propaganda makes it seem as though Mapara was a triumph for Aerial 1080. This is an outrage in itself, and as I think everyone would agree, that this is gross misrepresentation. This distracts from what is probably a very useful observation. Namely, with species-specific, ground-based trapping, you can actually help native species to recover.
I got a license to use 1080 in 1960. I did a lot of the original research into this poison, and I've used it virtually ever since. Most of my working life's been involved with it. I've done all the groundwork, I've done the aerial operations, I've mixed the field solutions, I've done the whole lot. And it's been my repeated trips back to the same places all the time over many years that's shown very clearly the effect it's having. And even when I was using it. So unless we do something about it, they are going to be responsible for wiping some of our native birds out. I've heard all the stories about the good nesting after they've done the drops and that, and most of it to me is rubbish. Department of Conservation studiously ignore everyone but themselves.
DOC claims that in 2010 they're going to start a study to, quotes, determine the effect of Aerial 1080 on native birds. Even assuming that they abandon all their bad study design habits, they are at least 17 or 18 years late. They have been dropping this substance into our environment, into our native forest, indiscriminately, killing thousands, tens of thousands, and maybe hundreds of thousands of native birds for 17 years. And now they're telling us that they're going to go do a study that we have no assurance will be at any better quality than the ones they've already done? 2019, when that study is finished, the game will be over. What they should do is to stop this practice now until they have legitimate proof of benefit to native species. A 10-year study is about what it would take.